Okay, so I'm going to continue with talking about something which I started last video, which was saying that, maybe that narrative games which just tell you a story basically aren't doing enough. And certainly that's been something that people have said on a level of mechanical interactivity. It's not enough to warrant a game, which is why they've got called walking simulators. But I'm going to suggest that actually it's not enough on a narrative level, and that there's so much more you could be doing. So to do this, I'm going to talk about a game which I played recently, which is quite acclaimed and I didn't care for. It's called Before I Forget. It's by Chella Ramanan, and it concerns a woman struggling with dementia and the loss of her spouse. And it's very prettily rendered, but my main problem with it is it's mostly involved in exposition. There's some level of interaction which is quite perfunctory and doesn't really ask you to grapple much, so you have to look on a star chart and move things around, and then you get a bit more story and a bit more story and a bit more story. And whilst it's certainly been widely praised for its depiction of mental illness and onset dementia, I found in terms of telling a story, it didn't really stick with me. And I think this is what it comes down to: is there's a real case of show and tell, but also this other thing which we ask people to do in games, which is to really grapple with stuff, to interact. And so, in order to talk about this, I want to examine an idea in education called Bloom's Taxonomy, which is imagine, just remember the best teacher that you had, and what they would do is they would tell you things, and they might tell you things very eloquently, but if they just left it there, even if you were very moved, you might not remember all of that. But of course, what good teachers do is they get you to think about it, to comprehend it, to apply it, and maybe if they're really good, they'll get you to then synthesize something new. So you might learn about history, and you'll be asked to analyze it, and you'll be asked to think about the implications of that event. And then you might sit down and write a piece from a diary of someone who lived through that famous battle. All very exciting, but there's something really in there for games design. Now, I talk about Obra Dinn a lot, but really, it's also being involved in my own game design that I came to see this. And so I have a game called Rivals, which asks you to be a biographer, completing the biography of two musicians. And for these, I've always written the original soundtrack, and there's 8 tracks. And when I was playtesting it, I used to, in a previous game, I had lots of clues embedded to the answers within the tracks. So there was musical clues. And when I was playtesting Rivals, I hadn't done that so much. They were more just for ambient detail. And I found that people weren't listening to them. And when we talked about it, they said, well, I didn't really see any need to listen to them. And so they weren't really commenting on how much they enjoyed the tracks because they simply weren't hearing them. And what I realized is within a game, if you're not asking people to really tussle with something, if they don't have a reason to engage with it, then they might not, and it might not impact on them. And sure enough, I built some clues and built some reason to have to listen to the tracks, and people had a much deeper emotional experience. And what this made me realize is that these two things of engaging with something and having an emotional experience are not separate to each other. You can have an emotional experience of something without really engaging with it, but it's nothing compared to when you really engage with something and think about it. And you're much more likely to associate yourself with the events depicted or with the people involved when you've really had a chance to tussle. So what I've found is that, and this I got a lot from watching Let's Players as well, is that the deeper in people got and the more they went beyond just being told something into they were analysing it, because my game's about analysis, and then comprehending it, and sometimes making value judgments about those things, taking educated guesses for which they were rewarded, the more deeply entwined they become with the story and richer emotional experience they'd had. They were actually learning more about the story because of their method of interacting with it. And going back to what I said in the previous one, I said maybe narrative games need to go back to where they started with puzzles. And this is really the reason why, which is as teachers, we can tell people things and they might remember it and they might be inspired by it. But if we want them to really, really tussle with it and maybe for it to have a lasting impression, we need to take them further up the taxonomy. So we need to analyse stuff and to really understand what that means. And then maybe even to build something new off the back of that. And how do we do that? Well, within games, the simplest thing is puzzles, because puzzles have answers But the way that we can get to answers is not always through trivial means. We can ask people to make proper judgments, educated guesses, as long as there's an answer at the end, or in the case of her story, not an answer. You can ask people to engage using all sorts of skills that are not traditionally catered for in narrative games that just tell people things. So that's my take on it, and I hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.